think one of the things I was thinking about there as you were talking, Chris, what are the correctives? And I know I'm turning it on its head a bit here now, but I want to how do we think about the correctives for oracy here? Because I know there'll be so many teachers listening that have a tough class, right? Where behavior isn't necessarily the perfect idyllic norms and cultures that the ECF lays out, that we're aiming for, the nirvana. The often lived reality of it is that we don't get to that nirvana. we get as close as we damn can, but we don't necessarily get there. So my sort of thinking is what are the correctives for oracy? How do we go around without sort of crushing conversations, but also at the same time, do we pose sort of questions that help guide children, but are not too intrusive? I don't know. I know I've broke the format a little bit here by asking a question. I'm just really interested in both of your expertise, because you both have a lot to say. So I really want to know what your thinking is, and then I'll listen to you and then see if I've got anything to add, because I think it's a really interesting one about how do we interact in that. So I know we can model, but in the same way we would correct behaviors, what are your thoughts on that?
Classic LWJ curveball. I'm pretty sure you threw one of those in last time you were on. You may not get invited back much more often, Lloyd, if this is going to be the way things go. If you think about the stuff I've written before, I'm trying to guide acceptable or beneficial responses as much as possible before you get in that situation. There are certain phrases that will work in a conversation that can make them more productive because they lead to an expression of what the pupils have thought. My big thing is that pupils, they may understand, they may see patterns, but they can't articulate what they see. And if we provide them with a scaffold, and perhaps then if you're tracking and you refer back to the scaffold, and that was fantastic, where's the because, or what's the why? And then push that conversation on a little bit further, because you don't necessarily want to get involved in a mathematical conversation at that point, because that defeats the purpose of the error tracking, because you're trying to pick up what's the big idea that's been missed here, or where are we going wrong? And then you go back and you do your instruction, you do some more examples. So I think, it's having a scaffold for me, and then pointing pupils towards the scaffold, because, they're not going to be able to, they don't become articulate and eloquent overnight. But if they're in the same situation time and time again, eventually that becomes a part of who they are and how they approach dialogue, just going right back to what you guys were saying. So I think, to have a scaffold and guide toward that when you hear that it's not being utilized as effectively as you might hope.
Yeah, it is a great question, Lloyd. And I'm always keen to engage in the conversation that gets into the practical elements of it. It's very easy, especially on a podcast, to start talking about we can do this and I like doing that. And it gets away from the practical day-to-day realities. I would say the things that jumped into my mind when I've had classes where I've struggled to engage them in productive conversation, like peer on peer. Firstly, I'd say if you're trying to engage them in conversations which are more than peer on peer, when there's, say, a group of 3 or 4, don't do that. If that's not working, stick to pairs, and stick to the same pairs for a period of time so that becomes predictable. I would also say something I've done is, and this kind of ties back into something we talked about earlier, where I have a tendency to float, to try and gather information. If I've got a class where I think they're struggling just with the behavioral expectations, effectively, of collaborative talk, I will stay at the front of the room where I can see everyone and I can see whether that discussion is happening for a while. Eventually, where things are really working well, I might start to move around the room. It's worth noting as well that it isn't necessarily the front of the room that's the best place for that. Sometimes the back of the room is even better for that, where the children know that you can see them, but don't know whether you're looking at them at that moment. I know that sounds a bit like I'm acting as a security camera, but really actually just being at the back of the room for that can be a bit more supportive in some ways, rather than, so they know that they're being observed, but at the same time, they don't feel like you're glaring at them, can be a really nice way to deal with things. You make that a teaching point rather than saying, today I'm going to be using partner talk in order to facilitate the learning of mathematics, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, today I want the children to get better at partner talk. And that's your goal. Because you're going to use it across the rest of the year as a pedagogical tool, at first you're thinking, how do I build up to this slowly? So you might start off with small chunks of time. So talk to your partner about this very simple thing. What answer did you get? 10 seconds, off you go. And then you gradually build it up. Equally, you can use things like sentence stems. So things like, okay, we're talking about something we liked about this chapter in the book. Here's a sentence stem I'd like you to use. And even scaffolding it as far as, okay, children on this side, you're person A, put your hands up, person A. Children on this side, you're person B, put your hand up, person B. Today, person A is going to go first. Because again, it's these little structural elements of partner talk that some children struggle with about who goes first. And so making that quite structured at first and then loosening the reins over time can be supportive. When it comes to talking about modeling, is the idea of, oh no, we want complete sentences, we want whole sentences, we want children to talk in full sentences. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I think there is definitely a case in which we can support children to be more clear in their spoken communication, but it's that I'm focused on. I want them to be more clear rather than just moving towards sentences that sound like they could have been read from a book. And part of that, more often than not, I don't know if this is your experience, guys, you can probably feed back to me on this. I find the thing that children struggle with most is not just going on and on and on and on and on and on and on, and not knowing where to draw a line, or not thinking in advance how to be brief. Ironic, given that I've now talked for about 2 minutes non-stop. But yeah, I find that's supporting them to be concise is a really big challenge, and the thing that I focus on across a year. And sometimes that will just mean interrupting.
I think it's a really, really valid point there, Chris. Like, there's naturally, with personalities, going to be stronger personalities than others in the classroom. And when you're structuring and supporting oracy in the classroom, it's something you have to consider, and you have to, like Chris said, you really do have to explicitly model for both parties. One, when someone needs to bring things to a close, that's a bit of emotional intelligence from that. You know, we have a duty to develop emotional intelligence, be able, the ability to read a room, read what's going on in front of you as a social cue, but also the ability to speak up and to go, sorry, can I just, and step in and have this say. And children famously are not, well, adults famously are not very good at it. Like, my dad would talk for Wales. Like, after, I had to chip in. I've just had 3 days of it. I would chip in, like, at the end of the day, if nobody models that for you, if nobody makes that explicit, if nobody kind of codifies that for you, then there will be some people that just will never learn that, and so I feel this kind of echoes back to that kind of, again, I'm coming back around to the ECF. Like, I just think that the attention to detail in there, in terms of codifying things that we should have codified a long time ago in teaching, and that is now thankfully has happened in a lot of senses, and I know TLAC's also very good for doing that as well, and but getting down and actually saying out loud, this is a thing that needs to be taught and needs to be explicitly said. I think that there's such a power in that, and realistically, if you want children to engage in the process properly, then you have to do that. I think it's really interesting as well, just finally, in terms of, like, I go back to the question, like, in terms of what we do and how we correct it, because my head is thinking, like, it's a fine balance, isn't it, between when you intervene as a teacher that is going to stop a child that potentially has worked up the courage to explain something back to the partner. I think, so I'm going to crack this here, and it might not be correct, or it might not be right. And then it's knowing that as a practitioner to say, okay, I'm going to let them go with that a minute, just because you know your children and you know your context, and you know that they need that confidence to talk, and they might be wrong, right? And I know, that flies in the face of smashing down misconceptions and what have you, right? Yeah, I know that, and it probably isn't a popular thing to say, but it's important, isn't it? When you think about relationships, and you think about if you want to foster the right culture in your room, You've got to know that stuff. I think that, you know, and you've got to be able to work as a practitioner, which makes it that much harder when you're an early career teacher, because you just don't have that experiential knowledge of seeing children in that situation, seeing those interactions thousands and thousands of times and going, oh, I know that he or she needs that bit of space here to do that. And again, I know that's not a nice, neat takeaway for you from the podcast, but I think it's worthwhile talking about, because I think it's a pertinent sort of issue when considering oracy.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. There is such a person-to-person, class-to-class, individual element to talk and how you deal with partner talk in particular. I would say something that might be a more general takeaway, though, and this is something that people will be sick of me hearing me say, but I think being careful with praise when children are having had that conversation, when they are feeding back, the use of, I've not really got a term for this yet, but I guess neutral encouragement, just like, oh, thank you, great stuff, let's move on. But also knowing that that's what you're going to say, regardless of whether the answer is mind-blowing or whether it's something that isn't quite right. So that children, just, again, as I say all the time, you take the pressure off, not just from how you deal with things when they're not correct, but also by how you deal with things when they are correct. Because if, you know, one child hears, oh, that's incredible, wonderful, and then the next child hears just thank you, it feels like a real kick in the guts.